Under the same sun that burns the Sahel bare, a young man dared to do what no leader had done before. They called him reckless. They called him mad. But he called it faith in his people, in the land, in Africa itself. Under a sky scoured by wind and heat, they said the desert always wins. They said that once the dunes take a village, once the wells fall silent, there is nothing left to do but leave. But in the heart of the Sahel, a people stood and answered with a sentence that bears repeating, softly at first, then like a drum. Not here. Not us. Not anymore. This is the story of Burkina Faso and its young president, Ibrahim Traoré. A story not of spectacle or saviors, but of hands and hope, of low-tech wisdom and stubborn faith, of a land learning to breathe again. For half a century, the Sahel has been creeping southwards, a slow-motion catastrophe stretching across a belt of 5,400 kilometers from Senegal to Sudan. In Burkina Faso, the front line runs across a fragile land where the horizon wavers like a mirage. Between 1970 and 2020, average rainfall fell by nearly 25%. The temperature rose faster here than almost anywhere else on Earth. Each year, the desert ate 250,000 hectares of farmland, and with every storm, another village disappeared from the map. The Sahel does not attack with thunder. It advances like a whisper, carrying away resolve grain by grain. Mothers wrapped their children and walked south. Fathers stood before fields turned to bone and asked questions the earth no longer answered. The silence was heavier than sand. 1/3 of Burkina Faso's land, 100,000 square kilometers, leaned toward the edge of the livable world. When a nation forgets the sound of water, it begins to forget itself. But one man, still in his 30s, refused to surrender to the wind. President Ibrahim Traoré, born in Bobo Dioulasso and shaped by the dust of his country's western plains, looked upon the crisis not as fate, but as a test. He saw a nation weary of promises, rich in will. He did not summon foreign machines or hire distant consultants. He asked his people for something smaller, tougher, truer. He asked for work, unity, and trust. He began not with steel, not with spectacle, but with straw. There is a kind of brilliance that hides in plain sight. Straw, the stalks left after harvest, light, fragile, often burned, often ignored. In the northern provinces of Oudalan and Seno, villagers gathered at dawn to bind that nothingness into bundles. They tied them with sisal rope, laid them in squares, and those squares became grids. The grids stretched across the dunes like a patient geometry of hope. From above, they looked like chessboards on the bones of the earth. At first glance, absurd, but beneath, a simple science waited. Each square broke the wind. Each lattice trapped a little moisture. Each dry stem returned to the soil, softened as it decomposed and offered food for life to begin again. Within those fragile boundaries, seeds stopped running and started rooting. The first year, 12,000 hectares were covered. By the third, 40,000 hectares. Local meteorological stations recorded wind speed reductions of 35% and soil moisture retention up by 22%. In test plots, millet yields doubled. Sorghum returned to fields thought dead. The desert knows persistence. So does straw. Then came the saplings. Acacia, which remembers drought like a scar. Moringa, with its leaves dense in iron and calcium. Balanites, whose roots hold dunes in place. One by one, in the shade of those straw grids, green returned. Not a flood, not a carpet, but a mosaic of survival. Enough to lower the air temperature by nearly 2 degrees Celsius. Enough to hold the soil when the wind came back to test it. Enough to tell a different story from the one the world had written for them. But straw alone cannot quench the oldest thirst. Water in the Sahel is both ghost and gospel, unseen, necessary, prayed for. Beneath the sand lie aquifers, old rivers sleeping under stone. With local engineers and hydrologists, the government mapped and tapped that hidden life. 800 reservoirs and 1 of 300 microponds appeared like mirrors cupping the sky. Around them, channels carried runoff from the rare rains, trapping each drop before it could flee. And into those mirrors they let fish swim. Fish in the desert. It sounded like madness. Yet there is wisdom in the impossible. Tilapia nilotica, hardy and forgiving, took to the warm water. Solar-powered sensors tracked pH, temperature, and oxygen. Young men and women learned the arithmetic of aquaculture, when to feed, when to harvest, how to keep a pond alive under a merciless sky. Within 18 months, 200 tons of fish were harvested. Markets in Dori and Wahiguya sold desert tilapia for the first time. Nutrition improved. Childhood malnutrition dropped 11% in the project areas. For families that had not tasted fish in years, it was not just food, it was proof. Proof that the desert could be defied. And something changed, not only in the land, but in the eyes of the people. Women formed cooperatives to run nurseries and mix fish feed. They managed accounts, built micro-enterprises, and trained others. Incomes in some communities rose by nearly 30%. Teachers brought pupils to the fields and taught climate science through touch, showing how straw slows wind, how roots keep earth, how life returns by design, not miracle. Elders sat beneath trees that had once been shrubs and whispered the only phrase that carries redemption in a land of dust. It is possible. In Wahiguya, where sand once pushed against doorways, President Traoré stood before farmers, elders, and children and lifted a handful of soil, the dark kind that clings to the fingers. This, he said, is what victory feels like. Not in parades, not in treaties. Here, the crowd roared. Elders wept. For a heartbeat, a nation remembered its own name. Yet the work is not a pageant. It is a practice. Ponds must be rested and rotated. Straw must be relayed after storms. Species must be mixed so that failure in one patch does not spread. Drones map heat and green, guiding farmers to where effort is needed most. This is not triumph declared, it is resilience rehearsed. And because it is rehearsed, it becomes culture. Word traveled. Delegations came from Niger, Mali, and Chad, countries that share the same dust in their lungs. They touched the straw, tasted the fish, shaded their eyes to look across fields that defied logic. They did not speak much, but they left with a question burning like an ember. If it can be done here, why not there? Beyond Africa, the reactions split along familiar lines. Scientists smiled. Strategists frowned. Because this method is cheap, simple, unownable. It gives power to the smallest unit of politics, the household, and to the oldest unit of civilization, the village. It is hard to control what ordinary people can already do with their own hands. Perhaps that is why this story unsettles certain rooms and settles certain hearts. The deeper truth is simpler still. Dignity returned. You cannot measure dignity with a gauge. You see it in the slower handshake, the straighter back at dusk, the difference between waiting for aid and walking to your own pond. Dignity is the true currency of nations. Once it circulates, everything else, safety, schooling, enterprise, finds a fairer price. There are doubts, as there should be. What if rains fail again? What if disease sweeps the ponds? What if armed men return to roads that have only just grown kind? The answers are humble. Diversify species, rotate ponds, spread risk, train more hands. Protect what you build by building it with everyone you can. Fear divides. Work binds. History, too, speaks from beneath the sand. Colonial borders once cut through grazing lands. Cash crops stripped the soil. Dependency taught nations to wait for permission. Ibrahim Traoré proposed heresy in that order, that Africans could heal Africa by trusting what they already know. It was not rebellion, it was remembrance. International observers began to measure. The UN Environment Program estimated that the project captured 1.4 million tons of carbon and restored 55 million cubic meters of soil water storage. The World Food Program observed 15% less migration from pilot zones. The African Development Bank funded new training centers, not for machines, but for mentors. Agricultural scientists began calling it the Burkina model, a fusion of traditional wisdom and practical science described as an African scientist's breakthrough. By 2025, straw grids and ponds stretched across 62 districts. More than 300,000 citizens took part directly, and 2 million more benefited from cooler microclimates and new livelihoods. 30% were women, many earning income for the first time. Youth unemployment dropped 20%. School attendance in rural areas rose 18%. In Niger, 500 villages began straw grid trials. Senegal's Great Green Wall Agency integrated Burkina Faso methods. In Ghana, wind erosion along the frontier fell measurably. Even in Ethiopia's Afar region, local elders came to see the ponds. Europe watched with mixed feelings. Environmentalists cheered. Policymakers whispered, because a self-reliant Burkina Faso is a precedent. In Washington, USAID analysts recommended partnership framed as mutual learning. In Beijing, research delegations took notes. But in the markets of Dori, the only policy that mattered was the price of fish and the laughter of children buying it. Meanwhile, the government launched the Green Corps, a national youth program for agroecology and aquaculture. 10,000 recruits received solar pumps, hand tools, and smartphones with soil monitoring apps. Their motto stitched in green, La dignité fait pousser les arbres. Dignity makes trees grow. Satellite imagery confirmed what eyes could see. Vegetation density up 18%, soil moisture up 22%, surface wind speed down enough to save 5,000 hectares of farmland yearly. Crop yields rose 25%. Local crime rates dropped 12%. Hope became measurable. And yet the greatest transformation was cultural. In the markets, new words joined old songs. Sahel tilapia, desert oil seed, moringa of Wahiguya. A currency of pride began to circulate. Families that once sent sons to the coast now stayed to tend ponds. Women's cooperatives became anchors of peace. Teachers rewrote lessons to include the physics of straw and the ethics of care. In Wahiguya, a grandmother of 62, small in frame and vast in resolve, showed a journalist the line where sand stops and seedlings start. She spoke not of politics but of shade at noon, of a grandchild who did not leave this year. She scooped a little soil into her hand, rubbed it between finger and thumb, and smiled the most political smile in the world, the smile of someone whose tomorrow feels lighter than her yesterday. What does the world owe such a woman? Not pity, partnership. Not lectures, listening. Not imported plans, respect for what already works. If a project cannot explain itself to her in a minute and prove itself in a season, it has no business arriving with banners. If you are hearing this far away, if you are a pastor with a choir that still sings the old songs, if you are a grandfather whose hands remember tools, if you are a grandmother whose prayers never learn to quit, know this: your story and this story keep each other company. The names differ. The work is the same. Stand, plant, water, wait, give thanks, repeat. To those who ask what they can do, begin where you are. Share this story with one friend who needs good news that is sturdy, not sweet. Speak the names right: Ibrahim Traoré, Wahiguya, Sahel, because names are seeds. When you say them properly, they grow in the mind as places worth caring about. And if you wish to leave a mark in a loud world, leave it where the algorithm can see. Write 3 words beneath this story and mean them: dignity rising. No one knows how many storms lie ahead. No one can promise every pond will endure or every tree will live long enough to cast a teaching shadow. But this much is already true. The earth has answered the hands that refuse to idle. The wind has learned new manners where straw drew its thin lines. The future has bent, if only a little, toward the people who must live inside it. The desert, when it listens, hears something it cannot explain. It hears a nation speaking in the present tense. They said the desert always wins, and in many places for a long time it did. But listen again. Listen closely. On a morning in the Sahel, when the light is still soft and the air is kind, you can hear a different sentence being laid down, square by square, pond by pond, leaf by leaf, until even the sand begins to understand. Not here. Not us. Not anymore.